Before we start today's video, today at 9:30 PM GMT on the Cthulhu-Kin and Friends show, and also if all goes to plan, on stream.me, I will be doing a full response to Prime Minister's questions. I fully expect Brexit, the mutiny that hasn't quite gone through yet, for many reasons, and we'll certainly cover those. Also the damning numbers about waiting time targets with the NHS, what with winter coming up. I can imagine this to be quite bad. For the Health Secretary, who was formerly Jeremy Hunt, I believe, who is now Foreign Secretary. I don't actually know who the Health Secretary is anymore. Also, and I think I should have done this as a Twitter poll, if two people in animal onesies have sex, are they yiffing? It's totally unrelated to the subject matter, and it was something that occurred to me when I was laying in bed last night. And no, I was not drunk. Although if I was, I guess that would have been a better excuse. Moving on. The subject of today's video is going to be the infamous, and we've covered this before, should women be incarcerated, and then whatever reason is given. Many excuses are given. In Australia, the excuses were the psychological damage it does to a woman, forgetting here that she committed a crime. Yes, there are mitigating factors, which is why I would treat it on an individual basis, and the severity of the crime, which should of course play a part. If it was shoplifting, I would support suspended sentences to an extent. Community service, of course, as well. Over in the United States of America, there are articles that go all the way back to November of 2014 through a feminist perspective, where articles like this from the Washington Post will say, it sounds like a radical idea, stop incarcerating women, and close down women's prisons. But in Britain, there is a growing movement, sponsored by a peer in the House of Lords to do just that. The peer in question is Baroness Corsten, who in 2007 introduced what is more commonly known as the Corsten Report. The Corsten Report explored the idea that if a lot of women that are in prison are mentally ill, whether or not they should be there. But as many of you have known over the time I've been talking about injustice, a lot of females that get accused of crimes are then fobbed off as mentally ill. Either more women are mentally ill than they would like to admit, or many are willing to use the excuse and abuse the system to avoid justice. The report basically outlined, and I'm going to quote it, the need for a distinct, radically different, visibly led, strategic, proportionate, holistic, women-centered, integrated approach. That is a lot of commas. The reason Baroness Corsten started this was because of the deaths of 6 women at Styal Prison in Cheshire between the summer of 2002 and the summer of 2003. Now, if the policy had been adopted, it would see Holloway and 14 other all-female prisons in England shut down or converted into jails for men, and of course at the same time replacing them with small secure units. You remember those community centres we talked about a few months back? Those, which are now being currently pursued by the current Justice whoever, prisons minister I assume. Whoever it is, I'm going to put a picture of him on the screen now. This idiot. To go back to the Washington Post article, because I do want to cover a few more elements of it, the argument is actually straightforward. There are far fewer women in prison than men to start with. A fallacy. Women make up just 7% of the prison population. This means that these women are disproportionately affected by a system designed for men. Or, and this is something people don't seem to understand, men are affected, but have become so enamored to it, through generations of this. Is it systematic or systemic? They have become so used to this particular system, this type of justice being imposed upon them, that they are simply dealing with it as they should. Whether or not they are rehabilitated is a different matter entirely. Whether or not they are affected mentally is another issue as well, something we don't actually talk much about. The effects of prisons on men, and whether or not those men who were sentenced fairly, because we have to understand here, you can compare 2 crimes committed by a man and a woman, the same crime committed, but if one of them goes to prison, even though the circumstances are identical, then we have to accept here the justice system is not fair. Perhaps judges are the way forward, and I mean me in this outfit, as opposed to the one sat with that pathetic little wig on. That's the most hair this idiot will ever see in his life on his head. What a Nimrod. The point is, and it's actually quite coincidental that International Men's Day came around at the time of dealing with this subject, which has been raised by Good Morning Britain on Twitter, which is the only reason I am revisiting this in the first place. The system may have been designed and built for men, but that does not mean the system cannot be adapted for women. Yes, women are harmed by going to prison, but then we would have to find a way of ensuring that justice was served, and that they served a suitable time as punishment for what they did. This, of course, should be based on individual case like any case, which is why there are so many inconsistencies in sentencing. I have yet to see a study that shows the mental effects on men when it comes to them serving time in prison, depending on their individual circumstances. That does not mean that one does not exist. It means I have yet to see it myself yet. There was something on Prison Reform Trust where it stated 26% of women and 16% of men said they had received treatment for a mental health problem in the year before custody. 25% of women and 15% of men in prison reported symptoms indicative of psychosis. The rate among the general public is about 4%. Self-inflicted deaths are 8.6 times more likely in prison than in general population. 70% of people who died from self-inflicted means whilst in prison had already been identified as having mental health needs. However, the Prisons and Probation Ombudsman found that concerns about mental health problems had only been flagged on entry to the prison just over half of these people. The PPO also found that no mental health referral was made when it should have been in 29% of self-inflicted deaths where mental health needs had already been identified. So it's all well and good wanting to protect women's mental health, but as you can see here, men's mental health is an issue as well. We are only isolating women's, because apparently the system is only designed for women. Well, that's because women were, subservient to men. They were not able to experience the world and life, and therefore they were not seen as the perpetrator of a crime. Now, of course, a consequence of equality is that women now have the freedom to do that. By the way, just to be clear, I'm sure women were committing crimes long ago. As we all know, women, some, can be quite vicious. Everyone has the potential to be that, though, so I'm not going to now go into all the subtle ways men and women differ in how they administer certain punishments, or how they would go about committing what is now more commonly known as a crime. Let's not forget here, standards have changed over time. The point is, maybe the system was built when men were mostly the criminals, but women had been punished as criminals before. We just burnt them at the stake or threw them into a lake, or applied a huge amount of pressure to their chest with a weight. And then of course when we got really creative, we got a guillotine, and we just did it because we considered them a criminal for religious reasons, or because they were a witch as I earlier stated, or because they supported the wrong horse. In politics, I'm thinking of the French Revolution, doesn't matter. Point is, the system was not designed solely for men, and that's how it should be. Should it be that women should not go to prison for committing the same crime as a man if a man is going to serve, say, 2 years for shoplifting? No. If she has kids, yes, of course that has to be taken into account. However, she committed a crime. It is not a case of making an example of her. It is a case of upholding the law and not bringing it into question when administering justice, all the while at the same time understanding individual circumstances when prosecuting. One must respect the mental health of all people who commit crime, and if it is recognized, that of course becomes a mitigating factor in administering justice and punishing them suitably. For example, if someone does have a mental health condition, of course they require help, but they've still committed a crime. Therefore, a punishment, a lesser punishment depending on the crime itself, must be considered. And yes, when someone has kids and have a mental health issue, it is right that social services are brought in, somebody to watch over her, especially if psychosis has been noticed. I noticed in the Twitter thread that was underneath the Good Morning Britain tweet, many people pointing out women and men should be treated the same for the same crime. Gender should not factor into this. I personally do not support the idea of removing women's prisons to make them into men's prisons, to make community centres with minor lockdown facilities for women. Of course, rehabilitation is very important, but understanding the individual circumstance is key to ensuring that justice is effectively administered, which is actually a reason I'm not so keen on studies that show blah blah percentages for whichever demographic you are trying to understand. Because, as I've said, justice is never administered consistently. Therefore, these studies are going to be rife with inaccuracy for a whole plethora of reasons. There were some people lower down arguing about semantics, basically. Some questioning whether or not this kind of support for women would be applied to men. Many others not getting the point and just blaming men. It goes on for quite some time, in fact. But the basic point is if you break the law and it carries a custodial sentence, gender should not come into it. Other factors, yes, but they are, for the most part, not gender exclusive. And I know I've pissed someone off in the past about this particular subject. I believe they were called, Essence of Fag? Yes. I do not care about you and your response video. I don't do them anymore, so don't expect a response. I just know it exists because you linked it to me, and up until then I didn't even know you existed. Let's keep it that way. There are many studies that are going to show I'm wrong, but as I've stated, I do not agree with the majority of those studies because justice is not applied consistently, and you can't apply it consistently if you're going to address individual cases. I hope that gets into your rather faggy, dense head. Anyway, I hope everyone has a lovely Wednesday, and thank you all for listening.